The Carney government is trying to push through Bill C-22, which would require electronic service providers like phone companies, messaging apps like Signal and Telegram, and internet companies to store users' metadata for up to a year so that cops and CSIS can use it to, quote, combat threats and criminal activity. This is obviously for surveillance purposes. For those of you who don't know, metadata is information about your data, like the location you sent a text from, the type of camera you use to capture a video, that kind of thing. It can basically reveal where you go, who you communicate with, and what you do. The threshold for getting this info is low. As Marie-Hélène Gay notes in her column for The Rover, quote, it is based on a relatively low legal threshold, reasonable grounds to suspect. Technically, any jealous police officer or minister curious about the past of a person they are seeking to imprison or whose rights they are seeking to restrict could employ this. This bill will also allow law enforcement to use this information in court. Signal, an encrypted messaging app, said it would rather shut down Canadian operations than, quote, be compelled to compromise on the privacy promises we have made to our users. A lot of journalists like myself use this app to talk to vulnerable people. The Internet Society, a coalition of civil society organizations, companies, and cybersecurity experts, wrote an open letter to the government saying, quote, there is no way to provide backdoor access to encrypted data and communications without compromising the privacy and security of millions of law-abiding citizens. Conservative and NDP MPs and Green Party leader Elizabeth May voiced their opposition to C-22 during the second reading of the bill in April. Apple, Meta, and representatives from the US government worried that it could compromise cybersecurity. You know it's bad if tech giants and the US are telling you that it's not worth the trade-off for more surveillance. Bill C-22 could also compel international companies to break the law of its home country. Switzerland-based Proton VPN said they could not hand over data without following Swiss legal processes. The bill has passed its second reading, but is currently under review by the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. The Liberals say there's a lot of misunderstanding surrounding the bill, but that they're open to amending it.
One of the things people will often say with this is like, well, if you have nothing to hide, why would you mind someone looking? But a lot of people, millions, in fact, use apps like Signal and Proton. Why?
So Signal's a really interesting app because it's like open source and it has end-to-end encryption. Most like encrypted messaging services will have like an encryption decoding key. So if the company wanted to, it could, in fact, unencrypt your messages. Signal doesn't do that. They on their end can't unencrypt your messages. So it makes it so that it's a more secure service for people to use. Obviously, it's not perfect, as in like people can, you know, send screenshots of your message, someone installs malware on your phone, that kind of thing, people could still access. And with Proton, it's based in Switzerland. So a lot of people are moving away from Gmail because the US government is increasingly, you know, Google has been using mining stuff to train AI. There's worries that the US government can access it. It's based in the US. There's those kinds of concerns. And Proton's based in Switzerland, like we said, that has a pretty high threshold for violating people's privacy in their legislation. And the whole argument of like, oh, you have nothing to hide, like you'd be surprised. And it's not just about like, oh, I'll tell someone whatever, but as you know, people become increasingly criminalized, like we see what's been happening at protests where protesters are getting arrested, where on university campuses, like, you know, at McGill, they're asking you to present your ID everywhere you go. In the US, we've seen people getting deported when they had valid visas because they were at a Palestine protest. So that's
just what the data allows. They know where you were.
They know where you are. Like it can show where you are at all times because most of us are carrying our phones everywhere we go. So it's like if you are, you know, working with vulnerable people, if you're participating in community activism, whether you think it's like, whether you agree with, you know, what people in certain community groups are doing or not, at the same time, it's like, and whether or not you think you're safe, you're like, no, I'm abiding the law. The law can change. And the government can decide to surveil people when it wants to. And by allowing them this sort of backdoor access through a year's worth of metadata that these companies are now expected to store, combined with the low threshold of like, where you just have to like suspect, you don't have to believe that there's
Yeah.
wrongdoing. It makes it so that, yeah, like anyone can, like the law enforcement and the government, they can just sort of access anyone. And there's like a really long history of the government, the Canadian government.
Even without this bill.
Without this bill. There's a
Like-
long history of the Canadian government spying on Indigenous activists, right? Indigenous land defenders, even Indigenous people who are not involved in those movements, but just happen to live in communities where there's activism happening. So like, if you're sitting there thinking, well, I'm not breaking the law, what do I have to hide? You don't know when, say, the government's going to decide to build a pipeline through your land. And if you show up to a protest and there's like an injunction, or you're coordinating with people who are protesting something, you don't know. You don't know what's going to be criminalized
One
down the
person
line.
smashes a window or steals something, and then everyone connected to
Yeah.
that person becomes guilty by association. Before any of this happened, I mean, about 10 years ago, there was a scandal where the Montreal police were spying on journalists to find out what the source of a leak was. So while they say, well, no, we only wanted to find wrongdoing on our end, you're still spying on journalists.
Yeah, and just because someone's in law enforcement doesn't mean that they're a good person. Like,
wait, are you saying no?
So in Marie-Hélène's article, in her column, I should say, about this, you know, a police officer who's feeling vindictive of like an ex, for example, he can suspect her of something and then dig into, like, find out her location, where she's been going, who she's been seeing. Like, it's very worrying that law enforcement and CSIS could just like basically access this with a really, really, like I said, low threshold to just see everyone's data.
It's like a cocktail of like incredibly powerful technology and people who are flawed. You know, we're great and we're terrible. And like all of that with access to this kind of power is rarely a good combination.
And that's not to say that, like, obviously legislation is needed to sort of explore how law enforcement and the government should be able to access these things, because it obviously makes sense in certain scenarios. Like right now, if I think they can't even use stuff that they're able to publicly find themselves on the internet as evidence in court. Like, there are things that make a lot of sense. It makes sense to sort of try to encode, to try to contain what they can and cannot access, but this is seeming to sort of give them open access and also force companies like Signal that don't store this kind of data on purpose to protect people's privacy. It would force them to now not only like just have an encryption key so they can access it, but store it for a really long time and then provide it if compelled to do so, which completely goes against the whole point of this app, right? Like, so they're like, well, no, obviously we'll stop operating in Canada if you're going to make us do this, because we're not writing this into our code. Like,
yeah, and there's zero guarantee that any of this survives the Supreme Court challenge. So there, you know, there's plausibly a scenario where the cops use this for X number of years as it's making its way through the courts, and then all of the convictions and arrests they've made using this bill would then be invalidated, and we'd have wasted a tremendous amount of time.
And not even convictions and arrests. We're also talking about like mapping out networks, picking people to watch, right? Because once they sort of see who you're connected to, it makes it like, once they pick people that they think are at risk or whatever, it makes it so that it's not even just who they're bringing to court, it's who they're keeping tabs on.
Yeah.
So,
and then you throw AI into it, right? And it takes away, like, you don't have to have a person going through everything. You have a machine making deductions and associations based on, well, whatever is being fed by
we don't
cops.
know what kind of software they're using. We don't know. And this is why, again, it was so crazy when I saw that, like, the U.S. government was like, please don't do this.
The police state is like, guys, this is a police state.
Because they're right, though, that it opens storing that kind of data, having companies store that kind of data, and then hand it over to law enforcement and CSIS. And let's be honest, police forces aren't always super up to date on their, like, what kind of software they're using.
Yeah.
It makes it, when you open up access to data like that, you can't super control who has access to it necessarily if you have people who are sophisticated hackers, right? So it's a huge cybersecurity threat too. It's crazy.
Well, thanks for terrifying us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and quickly to kind of talk about, as journalists, it's important for us to have access to these kinds of apps, right? Like, I know I used it when I was writing the sex worker story, because it was like, obviously I'm talking to vulnerable people. We don't want these messages ending up in some kind of like investigation or whatever.
Yeah. If they go over the border and they have to give their phone up to someone,
yeah, if they cross the border, that's a big factor. Like it makes it a lot easier to communicate with vulnerable sources who want to stay anonymous. So
yeah, I'm like I'm illiterate on the tech side, but I sometimes manage to use it and appreciate that it makes me safer with my sources.
Yeah, it definitely makes people feel a lot more comfortable. And like, honestly, we don't, if this sort of happens, it makes it so that we're only going to really be able to coordinate with vulnerable sources in person. That's what that means.
Yeah.
And leave our phones at home, I guess.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of, that's where we're at now.
Not terrifying at all.
No.